Ohio. The word itself is a Mingo word meaning good river. Around Christmas time in 1776, in the Eastern Theater of the American Revolutionary War, George Washington was moving north, crossing the icy Delaware River. Meanwhile, in the Western Theater of the American Revolutionary War, Mingo General Plucky was moving south, crossing the icy Ohio River. On December 22nd, 1776, Plucky and 30 warriors are on the trail of George Rogers Clark and his small handful of men who had 500 pounds of gunpowder with them. George Rogers Clark passes the Mingo Indians at nighttime. While George Rogers Clark knows that the Mingos are out there and that he's being followed, he just isn't exactly for sure where. The next day, they're in Limestone, present-day Maysville, and they hide the gunpowder in 5 different places, about just a few miles outside of Maysville on the Ohio River. George Roger Clark then lets his boat go adrift, and then him and his men carry on by foot on land. While George Rogers Clark is at Hinkston's cabin on the west fork of the Licking River, George Rogers Clark and his men are resting, but they're told by 4 men that very few acts of violence by the Native Americans has happened, so there isn't a general invasion. It was just one group of Native Americans following George Rogers Clark, and the 4 men also told them that Colonel John Todd was in Kentucky somewhere. George Rogers Clark and 2 others go on to Harrodstown, while George Rogers Clark orders John Gabriel Jones and the rest of his men to stay put. George Rogers Clark left John Gabriel Jones there to protect the gunpowder, while George Rogers Clark went to Harrodstown to get some more men to haul the 500 pounds of gunpowder to the settlers' forts, and also to get some defense in case there's an attack. So the war dances that the Mingo would actually get involved with, there's one description here. Each warrior would have a tomahawk, a spear, or war mallet in his hand, and they all moved regularly towards the east in the direction they prepared to go to war. Then only one of them would sing at a time, and it was a call and response. They would sing about their past battles or what they were going to do, and then in between there was hee-ya, and that was the call and response. This lone singer would sing his song, then you would hear hee-ya in between the song, and then another person would sing their song. When the warrior that was singing had ended his song, he struck a war post with his tomahawk, and with a loud voice told what warlike exploits he had done and what he now intended to do, which was answered by the other warriors with loud shouts of applause. Some who had not before intended to go to war at this time were so animated by this performance that they were excited, took up the tomahawk, and they sung their war song, which also was answered with shouts of joy. As they were then initiated into the present marching company, the next morning, the company, the Mingos, Plucky, all collected at one place with their heads and faces painted with various colors and packs upon their backs. They marched off all silent except the commander, who in the front sung the traveling song, which began in this manner: Ho katain tehi gana, ho katain tehi gana. Just as the rear passed the end of the town, they began to fire in their slow manner from the front to the rear, which was accompanied with shouts and yells from all quarters. So Chief Plucky, his name is sometimes spelled Pluggy with 2 G's instead of CK, but his full name is Plucky with K's. So he was also called Tikan Yatarito or Plucky Minoti. Both Tikan Yatarito and Plucky Minoti are both Mohawk names. One could have been Plucky's war name. Chief Plucky was an 18th century Mingo chieftain and ally of the Mingo war chief Johnny Logan. And Johnny Logan was famous. Because of Johnny Logan, the American Revolution happened. Johnny Logan was famous for his retaliation against the settlers after the Yellow Creek Massacre during Lord Dunmore's War, and for his final testament about the entire matter called Logan's Lament. Who is there to mourn for Logan? Nobody. The word Mingo itself is not a Mingo word. It's an insulting exonym which stems from the Delaware word Minqua or Mink, which they used for the Susquehannock or any other Iroquois people, meaning treacherous. So that's what Mingo, Minaqua, that's what it meant, treacherous. So I'm not sure what they called themselves, but other people called the Mingos treacherous. The Mingos were noted for having a bad reputation and sometimes were referred to as blue Mingos or black Mingos for their misdeeds. Some say that the Mingo were made up of Seneca and Cayuga nations. Others say that the Mingo are a unique group unto themselves. The Mingo were groups of independent Iroquois, mixed Seneca and Cayuga hunters with a heavy percentage of descendants of the Neutrals, the Huron and Erie Indians who had been adopted by the Iroquois during the 1650s. They settled in Ohio and western Pennsylvania in the early 1700s and formed mixed villages with the Delaware and Shawnee who arrived later. Sometimes Mingo are identified with Seneca. I've heard Ohio Seneca are the same thing as the Mingo in old records, but they were possibly remnants of the Erie and Conestoga people. So that's a lot of different tribes that all fit under the banner of Mingo. So in short, the Mingos could be part Seneca, Cayuga, Neutral, Huron, Erie, Conestoga, Susquehannock, or they're their own people. The Mingo language helps to find out the Mingo's origins. The Mingo language belongs to the western subgroup of the North Iroquoian languages together with Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga. These languages are mutually understandable linguistically. Mingo is practically identical to Seneca with only some dialectical differences. Seneca and Mingo are less different from each other than American English is from British English. However, ethnically, historically, culturally, the Mingo and the Seneca are distinctly different tribes. The Mingo's family life was matrilineal, which means that the family line, names, tribal affiliation, and land came from the mother, and they would be carried on by the sisters and daughters. George Washington in 1753 had actually came across a Mingo warrior. This was right before, this actually starts the French and Indian War. In 1753, the Mingo warrior, also called half-king Tanacharson. So Tanacharson, the so-called half-king of the Six Nations, a Mingo warrior, and George Washington were walking through the backwoods of Pennsylvania, came across a French military delegation and jumped them, ambushed them, killed killed 10 of them, captured 21, and then one went missing. And one of the 10 that they had killed was the commander, was the French general Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. And eventually, George Washington, after the fall of Fort Necessity, will sign a document that says that it wasn't a military invasion or a battle, but that he took credit for Jumonville's assassination or his murder. And so it wasn't a declaration of war, it was outright murder. Now that's what starts the French and Indian War. So only one man named Monsieur had wandered off to relieve himself that morning. But again, Tanacharson is a Mingo that George Washington had met 23 years before 1776 at Logstown, a settlement along the Ohio River only a few miles west of the Fork. So after a hurried war council, the English and Tanacharson's 8 or 9 warriors set off to surround and attack the French, who quickly surrendered. This is George Washington as a British soldier, as a British general, or a small, sub-general. The French commander, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, was among the wounded with the French words, "Te n'es pas encore mort, mon Pierre, thou art not yet dead, my father." Tanacharson then sank his tomahawk into Jumonville's skull. He washed his hands with his brains, scalped him, but not before eating a portion of Jumonville's brain. So why would this half-king, Tanacharson, why would, Washington kill these people? Why would Tanacharson just eat, this man's brain, kill him, right? Washes his hands with the brain, eats his brain, scalps him. And it seems like he just killed him. I don't know if they're putting it on Tanacharson in order to absolve George Washington of his crimes. There was discussions in Parliament, and they said, my God, this backwoods battle in the middle of nowhere is going to start a world war. And the French and Indian War was a world war. So this initial incident that starts the French and Indian War was George Washington in the company of a Mingo warrior named Tanacharson. So why did Tanacharson tomahawk Jumonville and eat his brains? Well, because the French had killed and boiled and ate his father. So Tanacharson was just doing an eye for an eye revenge. The French did it to his father, so that's why he did it to Jumonville. Even though George Washington sent Christopher Gist into Kentucky to scout land for him, and George Washington later on would acquire 5,000 acres of Kentucky land, George Washington never set foot in the state of Kentucky, not even one time. Originally from a Mohawk band, Chief Plucky gathered a number of Mingo and Iroquois followers and moved westward, eventually settling on the site of present-day Delaware, Ohio in 1772. The town that Chief Plucky settled on was known as Chief Plucky's town. He's the main guy. The residents included Chippewa, Wyandot, and Ottawa warriors, as well as Mingos and Senecas, and a French blacksmith. Pluggy's town, a.k.a. Upper Chillicothe and Old Chillicothe, was 4 miles below Circleville, where the celebrated chief Johnny Logan had lived. Johnny Logan, the Yellow Creek Massacre, Logan's Lament. Who mourns for Logan? Nobody. Pluggy was the son of a Mingo headman, and Pluggy's town quickly became infamous as a staging ground for attacks against the Kentucky towns. July 2nd, 1776, the Declaration of Independence is written, issued, signed, and the American Revolutionary War officially begins. The official ceremony will be July 4th for the signing of the document. In the midst of the American Revolution, on December 7th, 1776, the Virginia legislature takes Kentucky over, designating Kentucky as Kentucky County, just a county of Virginia, and then totally fucking over Richard Henderson and Daniel Boone over on their Transylvania land purchase from the Cherokee natives. This left Kentucky settlers in doubt as to their legal status and the validity of their land titles. George Rogers Clark in 1774 served as a captain in the Virginia militia in Lord Dunmore's War. Both George Rogers Clark and Chief Plucky Menotti were both at the Battle of Point Pleasant, the first battle of the American Revolutionary War, even though they were on opposing sides. Other people that was there at the Battle of Point Pleasant: Chief Cornstalk, Blue Jacket, and Puck Shinwa, Tecumseh's father, who was killed at the Battle of Point Pleasant. Simon Kitten was also there. He was wounded. And James Herod, the founder of the first white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, had just missed the battle by a day or two. The Kentucky settlers were having issues with the Native Americans killing everybody, so George Rogers Clark petitioned the Virginia legislature to give him some gunpowder, which Virginia Governor Patrick Henry, and well-known land speculator, Indian killer, was hesitant to do. George Rogers Clark said to Patrick Henry and the Virginia legislature, if a country were not worth protecting, it was not worth claiming. And that argument got to Patrick Henry when he was thinking about his wealthy land speculator friends who had paid for Virginia land titles in Kentucky. So eventually, George Rogers Clark won and secured 500 pounds of gunpowder. So then you have John Gabriel Jones and George Rogers Clark acquired the 500 pounds of gunpowder. They had to get it from Pennsylvania, ship it down the Ohio River, and they were at Limestone, present-day Maysville, where they stored the 500 pounds of gunpowder. December 19th, 1776, The morale of the Patriot forces was boosted on this day when a new pamphlet titled The American Crisis, written by Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, was published. This is in the words of Thomas Paine. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Within a day of its publication in Philadelphia, George Washington ordered it to be read to all of his troops. It encouraged the soldiers and improved their tolerance for their difficult conditions. December 24th, 1776. There were roughly 1,380 Hessian soldiers in and around Trenton. Hessians were German soldiers hired by the British Empire. The British hired the Hessians to fight for them. They hired them through the German government. Around 30,000 German soldiers fought in the American Revolutionary War. They were called Hessians because a lot of them came from the area of Hesse Castle, which was a German-speaking state. Because Germany as a country didn't exist. It was about 30 or 40 German-speaking countries, and one of the German-speaking countries was Hesse Castle, and people from the country of Hesse were called Hessians. Many of the Hessians stayed in America and settled there after the war was over. On December 24th, 1776, Johann Rall, the commander under the British in Trenton, had received 2 American deserters who crossed the Delaware River and told the Hessians that the American army was ready to move. With typical Hessian bravado, Johann Rall dismissed or even welcomed the threat, stating, "We'll let them come. Why do we need defenses? We will go at them with the bayonet." After a string of losses and low American soldier morale, George Washington needed to score a victory. It didn't have to be a big one. He just needed to get a victory, a military victory. On the morning of December 25th, George Washington ordered his army to prepare 3 days of food and issued orders that every soldier be outfitted with fresh flints for their muskets. He was also somewhat worried by intelligence reports that the British were planning their own crossing once the Delaware was frozen over. Even though George Washington didn't father any children of his own, he had no kids. Therefore, he wasn't really a true, authentic father to anybody. Eventually, he would become known as the Father of America. On the morning of December 25th, 1776, Mingo chief Plucky led a band of 30 Mingo warriors down the Ohio and Licking rivers. George Rogers Clark and John Todd had met at Harrodstown. They met at the same time when George Rogers Clark, the last we left him, he had left John Gabriel Jones and some other men to stay and guard the gunpowder while he went to Harrodstown. When he was at Harrodstown, he runs into John Todd. John Todd assures George Rogers Clark that he could get the gunpowder to Harrodstown safely, so George Rogers Clark assigned John Todd 10 men to go along with Colonel John Todd to get the gunpowder that George Rogers Clark and his men had buried just outside of Limestone in between the Blue Licks and the Ohio River. Plucky was able to scout out John Todd's trail, and he ambushed John Todd and the 10-man team while they were marching along in a valley near the lower Blue Lick. When they ambushed the 10-man team under John Todd, John Gabriel Jones, George Rogers Clark's right-hand man for a year or so, was killed at the very onset of the shooting, and then William Graydon was also killed in the fusillade, which is a series of shots in short succession. So pow, 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 John Gabriel Jones, William Graydon, dead. Plucky captured 4 of George Rogers Clark's men, and then the other 4, including Colonel John Todd, were able to escape, the story later being told by one of the survivors, pioneer and hunter David Cooper. December 25th, 1776, At 4 p.m., George Washington's army turned out for its evening parade, where the troops were issued ammunition, and even the officers and musicians were ordered to carry muskets. Everyone has to carry muskets. Musicians, officers, everybody. They were told they were departing on a secret mission, marching 8 abreast in close formations in order to be as quiet as possible. They left the camp for McConkey's Ferry. Washington's plan required the crossing to begin as soon as it was dark enough to conceal their movements on the river, but most of the troops did not reach the crossing point until about 6 p.m., about 90 minutes after sunset. The weather got progressively worse, turning from drizzle to rain to sleet and snow. It blew a hurricane, recalled one soldier. December 25th, 1776, at 11 p.m. at night, George Washington's army commenced its crossing of the half-frozen Delaware River at 3 locations. George Washington, along with the commanders John Sullivan, Nathaniel Greene, John Glover, and Henry Knox, crossed the Delaware River with 2,400 troops, 18 cannons, baggage, and about 50 to 75 horses. They crossed at McConkey's Ferry Inn. They used Durham boats, ferry boats, and other crafts. They rounded up quickly. They had to hurry up and get these boats in order to get all these cannons, troops, baggage, and horses across the Delaware River. At the time of the crossing, Washington's army included the future 5th President, James Monroe, the future 1st Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Marshall, future Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and Arthur St. Clair, who later served as President of the Continental Congress and Governor of the Northwest Territory. And Arthur St. Clair is also known for a major Native American defeat that he will lose after the Revolution has already been fought and won. The 2,400 soldiers, led by 44-year-old George Washington, successfully braved the icy and freezing river and reached the New Jersey side of the Delaware just before dawn. Under the overall command of Colonel Henry Knox, the Continentals brought 18 cannons over the river, 3-pounders, 4-pounders, some 6-pounders, horses to pull the carriages, and enough ammunition for the coming battle. The 6-pounders, weighing as much as 1,750 pounds, were the most difficult to transport to the far side of the river. It took the American Army roughly 4 hours to march from the river crossing site to the outskirts of Trenton. Temperatures for the crossing range from 29 degrees to 33 degrees with brisk winds coming out of the northeast. The other 2 divisions, made up of some 3,000 men and crucial artillery, failed to reach the meeting point at the appointed time. The day after Christmas, December 26, 1776, at 8 a.m., George Washington, whenever he could get a free moment when he wasn't raping his slaves, he put his dentures in, which his dentures were made from the teeth of his dead slaves, into his mouth, and he got prepared for the morning of December 26 at 8 a.m. to lead his men into the Battle of Trenton. George Washington's force separated into 2 columns, reaching the outskirts of Trenton, and descended on the unsuspecting Hessians. Trenton's 1,400 Hessian defenders were groggy from the previous evening's festivities and underestimated the Patriot threat after months of decisive British victories throughout New York. Washington's men quickly overwhelmed the Germans' defenses, and by 9:30 a.m., just an hour and a half after the Battle of Trenton began, the town was surrounded. Although several hundred Hessians escaped, nearly 1,000 were captured at the cost of only 4 American lives. However, because most of Washington's army had failed to cross the Delaware River, he was without adequate artillery or men and was forced to withdraw from the town. James Monroe, the namesake of the Monroe Doctrine, was actually wounded at the Battle of Trenton. At the Battle of Trenton, 4 Americans were killed, 6 were wounded, while 22 Hessians were killed and 98 were wounded. The Americans captured 1,000 prisoners and seized muskets, powder, and artillery. The Hessian supplies had been plundered. Casks of captured rum were opened, so some of the celebrating troops got drunk. On December 29, 1776, at McClellan Station, where Georgetown, Kentucky now exists, was attacked by Chief Plucky and his 40 Mingo warriors. After John Gabriel Jones and William Graham were killed near the lower Blue Licks, Colonel John Todd and the other 3 survivors ran to McClellan Station, where they find Simon Kenton and George Rogers Clark. The Mingo warriors attacked McClellan's fort on Elkhorn, near present-day Royal Spring, Georgetown. McClellan Station was a settlement of 30 families located in present-day downtown Georgetown and defended by 20 settlers, including frontiersmen Robert Todd, Robert Ford, Robert Patterson, Edward Worthington, Charles White, and the founder, John B. McClellan, and his family and some other young men were there too. Plucky Minotee attacked McClellan's fort and retreated hours later. Charles White and John McClellan had been killed. The founder of McClellan Station had been killed. They aimed through the stack of sticks and they shot McClellan in the head. You also had General Robert Todd and Captain Edward Worthington were seriously wounded. During the retreat, Plucky himself was shot and killed by 4 of the fort's defenders in retribution for the death of McClellan. The rest of the settlers at McClellan Station ran away to Fort Boonesboro. After Plucky was killed, the Mingo warriors, the 30 or 40 or so, hung about the area for 2 days, and then they just went north to their villages, probably disoriented after seeing their chief, their main war chief, Plucky Minotee, Tikhon Yataraito, get killed. Simon Kenton and some men eventually get to the spot where the gunpowder is. They see that it's safe, and then Simon Kenton gets his men to carry it to George Rogers Clark at Fort Boonesboro successfully, where they distribute the gunpowder amongst the Kentucky settlers. Because of Plucky Minotee's attacks and others, by January 1st, 1777, 300 settlers had left and 7 of Kentucky's forts were abandoned, and only 300 settlers remained at Fort Boonesboro, Fort Harrod, and Logan Station on the entire frontier. There was only 3 stations, Boonesboro, Harrodstown, Logan Station, and only 300 settlers were in those 3 forts. James Harrod had got tired of his wife, so he took a wilderness divorce. He walked out, saying he was just going to get some cigarettes, and never came back. John Todd eventually died in 1782, along with Israel Boone, Daniel Boone's son, in the Battle of Blue Licks in Robertson County, Kentucky, one of the last battles of the Revolutionary War. Todd County, Kentucky, is named after him. George Rogers Clark, the great conqueror of the Northwest Territory, in spite of giving the United States over half of their territory at the time, lived in poverty for much of his elder life. His youngest brother was part of the Lewis and Clark Western Expedition. George Washington, since age 11, had been a devout slave owner when his father died. He became a slave owner at 11 years old. George Washington had at one time 300 slaves at Mount Vernon, which he worked 6 days a week from sun up to sundown. George Washington even took his slaves to the executive mansion when he became president so that he could exploit their free labor. George Washington, the 5-generation slave-owning land speculator who raised hemp and made his own moonshine whiskey, a member of the Freemasons, a secret society, a fraternity who plots against the world. George Washington, who didn't even have a middle name or any children, who used the teeth of his dead slaves as dentures, who dropped out of school when he was 15 years old, the man whose murder started the French and Indian War when he was a British general, the man who lost more battles in the American Revolution than winning. After genociding the Iroquois in northern New York, he earned himself the nickname Kanataktarius, which means town destroyer. Then George Washington also wars against the Shawnee and the Miami in Ohio when he becomes president. At 67 years old, George Washington eventually comes down with a cold, and because of medical malpractice, after 4 rounds of bloodletting, George Washington died. It was common knowledge back then amongst doctors that if you had toxins or something, pneumonia in your system, if you just bleed it out, just let all the blood just flow out. They bloodlet him. They took his blood out of his body 4 times, and then eventually his body goes into shock and he dies. So it's not clear if it was medical malpractice or the cold. Most likely, when people bleed you out, then you die, right? You need blood to live. Chief Plucky had invigorated the Mingo's zeal, and Plucky Menoetes' men eventually regrouped underneath Plucky's son. Plucky's son took his father's role as war chief of the Mingo, and the Mingo was a mixture. So there was Wampanoags, Mohicans, and Muncies, as well as the Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot warriors also fought underneath Plucky Menoetes' son. By February 1777, a party of Mingo warriors from Plucky Menoetes' town were conducting a series of raids against Kentucky settlements. So the assassination, the killing of Chief Plucky, Tikon Yachirito, Plucky Menoetes, did not stop what Plucky's town and his men were capable of doing, because by 2 months later they were leading raids against the Kentucky settlements. The original Chief Plucky Menoetes was later buried by members of his tribe on a bluff overhanging the nearby Royal Springs, and for a number of years afterwards, a popular legend claimed that the echo heard in Georgetown was the death cry of Chief Plucky Menoetes, the Mingo warrior.